Just another worthless old man taking up space. Those were the last words 17-year-old Jaden Williams spoke before he and his gang shoved 93-year-old Frederick Falcon Stevens headfirst into a trash can at Veterans Memorial Park in Springdale, Arkansas. What they didn't know was that Frederick wasn't just any old man, but a decorated veteran of 3 wars who had earned the respect of every Marine he'd ever served with. And what they definitely didn't know was that a full Marine Reserve battalion, conducting urban warfare exercises in the building overlooking the park, had watched every cruel second unfold through their scopes. In the next 2 hours, 4 troubled teenagers would learn the hardest lesson of their young lives about respect, honor, and the unbreakable bonds of military brotherhood. Because when you disrespect a Marine, especially a 93-year-old Marine, who gave his life to serve his country, the Corps doesn't just stand by and watch. They respond swift, decisive, and unforgettable. This is the story of how one moment of shocking cruelty in a quiet Arkansas town triggered a military intervention that would transform not just 4 teenagers, but an entire community, proving that the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, doesn't. And when you take off the uniform, it lasts a lifetime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Veterans Memorial Park in downtown Springdale, Arkansas, painting the bronze statue of a World War II soldier in golden light. The park sat in the heart of this small Arkansas town, surrounded by modest businesses and tree-lined residential streets where American flags hung from front porches and neighbors still waved to each other. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where respect for elders was expected, and where military service was honored above all else. Frederick Stevens moved slowly along the park's main pathway, his weathered aluminum cane tapping a steady rhythm against the concrete. At 93 years old, every step required deliberate effort, but his back remained straight despite the burden of nearly a century of living. His silver hair was neatly combed, his clothes clean and pressed, a testament to the military discipline that had shaped his character more than 70 years ago. The early morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, peaceful sounds that contrasted sharply with the memories that often filled his mind. People in Springdale knew Frederick as the quiet old man who fed the pigeons every morning at 7 sharp, rain or shine. They saw him shuffle to the same bench near the memorial statue, carrying a small paper bag of breadcrumbs he purchased weekly from George Papadopoulos at the Eagle's Nest Diner. What they didn't know was that behind those clear blue eyes lay the memories of 3 wars, dozens of battles, and the faces of countless young Marines who never made it home. "Morning, Mr. Stevens," called out Patricia Young, the neighborhood watch coordinator, as she passed by on her morning power walk. She wore bright purple athletic wear and moved with the determined pace of someone fighting middle age with vigorous exercise. "Good morning, Patricia," Frederick replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp of advanced age, but retaining the crisp diction of a man who once commanded respect with every word. "Beautiful day the Lord has given us." "That it is," she agreed, slowing her pace slightly. "You take care now, and don't let those pigeons boss you around too much." Frederick chuckled softly as she continued her circuit around the park. Patricia was kind, like most folks in Springdale, but their brief exchanges never went deeper than weather and pleasantries. He preferred it that way. The stories he carried weren't the kind you shared over casual conversation. Settling onto his usual bench, Frederick surveyed the memorial that dominated the center of the park. The bronze soldier stood at eternal attention, rifle at port arms, eyes fixed on some distant horizon. Below the statue, marble panels bore the names of local men who had died in service to their country. Frederick knew many of those names personally, boys he had trained, led, and in some cases held as they drew their final breaths on foreign soil. The pigeons began gathering almost immediately, their soft cooing sounds creating a natural soundtrack to the morning. Frederick smiled as he reached into his paper bag, withdrawing a handful of breadcrumbs. The birds showed no fear, having learned over months that this old man meant no harm. Several of the bolder ones landed directly at his feet, while others waited patiently in a growing circle around the bench. "Good morning, troops," Frederick said quietly, beginning his daily ritual of scattering the crumbs in small piles. It was a habit that had developed over the past 3 years, ever since his wife Grace had passed and left him truly alone for the first time in his adult life. The simple act of feeding these birds had become his anchor to routine, his reason to get up each morning and venture beyond the 4 walls of his small apartment. Frederick had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1943, lying about his age to join the fight against fascism. He was barely 17, a farm boy from rural Arkansas who had never been more than 50 miles from home. The recruiting sergeant had looked skeptical at his slight frame and baby face, but the determination in young Frederick's eyes had been unmistakable. "Son, you sure you're 18? The sergeant had asked, his pen hovering over the enlistment papers. "Yes, sir," Frederick had lied without hesitation. "Born September 15th, 1925. The sergeant had studied him for a long moment, then signed the papers. "Welcome to the Marine Corps, Stevens. Try not to get yourself killed before you learn something useful." Frederick had shipped out to Paris Island 3 weeks later, where drill instructors had systematically torn down his civilian identity and rebuilt him into something harder, more resilient. The scared farm boy who entered those barracks emerged 12 weeks later as a United States Marine, ready to take his place in the greatest conflict in human history. The Pacific Theater had been his classroom, where he learned lessons that no amount of training could truly prepare a young man for. Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Guam, Iwo Jima, each battle had added layers to his understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible weight of survival. He had been wounded twice, decorated 4 times, and promoted to sergeant before his 20th birthday. But Frederick's service hadn't ended with Japan's surrender. Korea had called him back to war in 1950, this time as a seasoned NCO responsible for training and leading younger Marines. The frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir had tested every lesson he thought he had learned about combat and leadership. Later, Vietnam had demanded one final tour, where he served as a master sergeant training troops for a conflict that defied all his previous understanding of warfare. 43 years of active duty had given Frederick a perspective on service and sacrifice that few Americans could truly comprehend. He had served under 11 different presidents, seen the Marine Corps evolve through multiple conflicts, and trained thousands of young men for the realities of combat. His chest full of ribbons and medals told only part of the story. The official recognition for valor and service that could never capture the weight of command decisions made under fire, or the grief of writing letters to parents whose sons would never come home. The pigeons finished their morning feast and began dispersing to various perches around the park. Frederick folded the empty paper bag and tucked it into his jacket pocket, preparing for the slow walk home. His small apartment waited 3 blocks away, filled with memories and mementos of a life lived in service to others. Photo albums documented his military career, while letters from former Marines kept him connected to the brotherhood that transcended age and retirement. A group of teenagers had gathered near the park's basketball court, their loud voices and casual profanity carrying across the peaceful morning air. Frederick glanced in their direction, noting their aggressive postures and dismissive attitude toward the elderly couple trying to use the walking path nearby. He recognized the type. Young people with too much time, too little supervision, and a dangerous lack of respect for authority or tradition. Mrs. Eleanor Davis, a 78-year-old widow who lived in Frederick's apartment building, approached the bench where he sat. She moved carefully with the help of a walker, her face creased with concern as she watched the teenagers intimidate other park visitors. "Morning, Frederick," she said, settling heavily onto the far end of the bench. "Those young people have been causing trouble all week. Yesterday they knocked over the trash cans and left garbage everywhere. Poor Michael Kowalski spent 2 hours cleaning up after them." Frederick nodded gravely. Michael was the park supervisor, a good man who took pride in maintaining the memorial and grounds. The disrespect shown to his work was just another symptom of a broader problem. Young people who had never learned the value of sacrifice or the importance of honoring those who came before them. "Times have changed, Eleanor," Frederick said carefully. "Some of these kids have never learned proper respect for their elders or their community. In my day, their parents would have taken a switch to them for behavior like that," Eleanor replied, adjusting her position to ease the arthritis in her hip. "Now nobody seems to care what these children do or where they go." Frederick understood her frustration, but he also recognized that behind most teenage rebellion lay deeper issues: broken families, economic pressures, and a culture that often failed to provide young people with positive role models or meaningful purposes. Still, respect for elders and community spaces shouldn't be negotiable, regardless of personal circumstances. The teenagers' voices grew louder as their group dynamics intensified. Frederick could see the familiar patterns of pack behavior. One, clear leader, several followers eager to prove their loyalty, and the dangerous escalation that occurred when young men felt the need to demonstrate their toughness to peers. It was a dynamic he had observed in countless young Marines, but military discipline and structure had channeled that energy toward positive purposes. "I should head back," Eleanor said, struggling to stand with her walker. "Doctor's appointment at 9:30. "Take care, Eleanor," Frederick replied. "Give my regards to Dr. Phillips." As she made her way slowly toward the park entrance, Frederick remained on the bench, watching the teenagers with the experienced eye of a man who had spent decades managing young people in high-stress situations. Their behavior patterns were textbook examples of misdirected energy and absent leadership. Without proper guidance, groups like this often escalated from petty vandalism to more serious criminal activity. The morning was still young, and Frederick's routine was far from complete. After returning home, he would read the newspaper cover. To cover, check his mail for letters from former Marines, and perhaps work on the memoir he had been writing sporadically for the past 5 years. It was a quiet life, deliberately simple, but filled with the kind of peace that only came from having served something greater than oneself. The sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the memorial park as Frederick prepared to begin the journey home. He had no way of knowing that this peaceful morning routine was about to be shattered, or that the teenagers across the park were about to make a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. Sometimes the most significant moments in our lives arrive without warning, dressed as ordinary Tuesday mornings in small Arkansas towns where old men feed pigeons and young people struggle to find their place in the world. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Across the park, 17-year-old Jaden Williams leaned against the basketball court fence, his backwards baseball cap casting shadows over eyes that held more anger than someone his age should carry. Standing just over 6 feet tall, with the lean build of someone who spent more time on street corners than in classrooms, Jaden commanded the attention of his 3 companions through a combination of intimidation and charisma that had served him well in the halls of Springdale High School. "This place is dead boring," Jaden announced, spitting into the dirt near his worn sneakers. "Nothing but old people and crybabies using this park." 16-year-old Sofia Martinez sat on the concrete bleachers, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, revealing a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident her mother could never afford to have properly treated. She wore oversized clothing that concealed her slight frame, a defensive strategy learned from years of trying to blend into the background of an unstable home life. "My mum's working a double shift again," Sophia said, staring at her phone screen. "Probably won't see her until Thursday." Mason Carter, 16 and desperately eager to maintain his position in the group, kicked at a loose piece of concrete. His clean clothes and expensive sneakers marked him as different from the others, the son of middle-class parents who worked construction and nursing respectively, but who had grown distant as their marriage deteriorated into bitter arguments and cold silences. "At least your mom talks to you," Mason muttered. "Mine just leaves notes on the refrigerator about what I'm doing wrong." Logan Brooks, the youngest at 15, remained quiet as usual. His father Richard owned a small restaurant that struggled to compete with chain establishments, while his mother Sharon worked as an accountant for a firm that barely paid enough to cover their mounting debts. Logan's silence often masked his intelligence. He maintained decent grades when he bothered attending classes, but found more acceptance among this group than in the academic circles where his natural abilities might have flourished. Jaden surveyed the park with the calculating gaze of someone always looking for opportunities to assert dominance. The peaceful morning scene irritated him. Elderly people walking dogs, mothers pushing strollers, and joggers following predictable routes around the paved paths. Everything about it represented the kind of stable, respectful community life that had always seemed beyond his reach. "Look at all these people acting like they own the place," Jaden said, his voice carrying the bitter edge that had become his trademark. "Walking around like they're so much better than everyone else." The truth was that Jaden's anger stemmed from deeper sources than teenage rebellion. His father, Kenneth Williams Sr., had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine before returning home with injuries both visible and hidden. The man, who had once been a respected leader of Marines, had struggled with alcohol, unemployment, and the kind of rage that comes from feeling forgotten by the country he had served. Their household had become a battlefield where Jaden learned that respect was something you took rather than earned. "You see that old guy by the statue?" Jaden pointed toward Frederick, who was finishing his morning routine with the pigeons. "Probably thinks he's some kind of war hero or something." Sophia glanced up from her phone, following Jaden's gaze. "He's just feeding birds, Jax. What's the big deal?" "The big deal is these old people think they deserve special treatment just because they're old," Jaden replied, his voice rising slightly. "My dad's always going on about respecting elders and honoring veterans and all that garbage. Where's the respect for people like us?" Mason nodded eagerly, desperate to maintain his standing in the group. "Yeah, like they ever did anything for us. They just sit around collecting Social Security while we can't even find decent jobs." Logan shifted uncomfortably on the bleachers. Something about the old man's quiet dignity reminded him of his grandfather, who had passed away the previous year. His grandfather had been a gentle soul who never spoke much about his military service, but who had always treated Logan with patience and kindness that seemed absent from most adult interactions. Jaden's resentment toward authority figures had been building for months. His grades had plummeted as he skipped more classes, and his relationship with his parents had deteriorated into open hostility. His older brother Anthony, a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps, represented everything Jaden felt he could never: measure up to disciplined, respected, successful in ways that seemed impossible for someone from their neighborhood. "Remember when that cop hassled us last week?" Jaden continued, warming to his theme. "Told us we couldn't hang out at the convenience store like we were criminals or something." We weren't doing anything wrong, Sophia agreed, though her tone lacked Jaden's venom. Her own encounters with authority had been shaped by social workers and school counselors who meant well but never seemed to understand the complexities of her home situation. Mason pulled out an energy drink from his backpack, cracking it open with more force than necessary. My dad keeps saying I need to show more respect, but when's the last time anyone showed us any respect? Teachers treat us like we're stupid, store owners watch us like we're going to steal something, and cops assume we're up to no good. The irony was that Mason's parents, Robert and Linda Carter, had tried desperately to provide their son with stability and opportunities. Robert worked long hours in construction to pay for Mason's participation in sports and activities, while Linda picked up extra nursing shifts to help save for college expenses. But their efforts had been overshadowed by their marital problems, leaving Mason feeling abandoned and resentful. Jaden stood up from the fence, his restless energy demanding action. I'm tired of just sitting here. Let's see what's going on. Around this place, the group began moving through the park, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere around them. Other visitors instinctively gave them space, sensing the potential for trouble in their body language and casual disregard for social boundaries. An elderly couple altered their walking route to avoid the teenagers, while a mother with young children gathered her family and headed toward the playground equipment. See how they look at us, Jaden pointed out, his voice carrying satisfaction at the reaction they provoked. Like we're some kind of disease or something. Sophia felt a familiar mixture of shame and defiance at the reactions they generated. Part of her understood why people were wary. Their group did have a reputation for minor vandalism and confrontational behavior. But another part of her resented being judged based on appearance and association rather than individual actions. Frederick had finished feeding the pigeons and was preparing to leave when the teenagers began their circuit of the park. His military training had taught him to assess potential threats quickly and accurately, and something about this group's dynamic triggered his protective instincts. Not fear for himself. He had faced far worse dangers than troubled teenagers, but concern for the other elderly visitors who might become targets for misdirected aggression. You know what bothers me most about people like that? Jaden gestured toward Frederick as they approached the memorial area. They act like their generation was so much better than ours, like they fought in some great war that made them heroes. Logan finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. Maybe they did fight in wars. Maybe that's why they deserve respect. Jaden spun around to face Logan, his eyes flashing with anger. Don't tell me you're buying into that patriotic garbage, too. Look around, Logan. Look at this town. Look at our schools. Look at the jobs available to people like us. What exactly did all that fighting accomplish? The confrontation brewing between the teenagers reflected deeper tensions within American society, generational divides, economic frustrations, and the challenge of maintaining respect for institutions and traditions in an era of rapid change. Each of the four young people carried legitimate grievances about their circumstances, but their lack of positive outlets for expressing those frustrations had led them toward increasingly destructive behaviors. Sophia's phone buzzed with a text message from her mother asking her to pick up her younger sister Carmen from school because Isabella would be working late again. The responsibility of caring for Carmen had fallen increasingly to Sophia as their mother struggled to maintain multiple jobs and their father remained absent from their lives. I have to get my sister later, Sophia announced, tucking the phone back into her pocket. How old is Carmen now? Mason asked, genuinely curious despite his current mood. 12, Sophia replied. She's getting good grades, staying out of trouble. Smart enough not to end up like us. The comment hung in the air, highlighting the self-awareness that existed beneath their defiant exteriors. Each of them understood that their current path led nowhere positive, but the alternative seemed equally hopeless. Academic success required resources and support systems they lacked, while legitimate employment opportunities in Springdale were limited for teenagers without family connections or exceptional skills. Frederick began his slow walk toward the park exit, his aluminum cane tapping steadily against the concrete path. The morning had been peaceful as usual, but something about the teenager's energy suggested that peace might not last much longer. His instincts, honed by decades of military service, told him to maintain awareness of his surroundings, while, avoiding unnecessary confrontation, Jaden watched the old man's careful progress with growing irritation. Everything about Frederick's demeanor, his straight posture, his deliberate movements, his obvious military bearing, represented the kind of respect and recognition that Jaden felt had been denied to him throughout his life. "Look at him," Jaden said to his companions, "walking around like he owns the place, like everybody should just get out of his way." "He's just an old man walking home," Logan said quietly, but his words lacked conviction. The group dynamic was shifting toward confrontation, and Logan's attempts at reason were being overwhelmed by Jaden's need to prove something to himself and his followers. The stage was set for a collision between two different Americas. One, represented by Frederick's generation of service and sacrifice, the other by Jaden's generation of frustration and rebellion. Neither side fully understood the other's perspective, and both carried legitimate grievances that had never been properly addressed. What happened next would depend on choices made in the heat of the moment, decisions that would echo far beyond this peaceful Tuesday morning in Springdale, Arkansas. The path to the park exit led directly past the memorial statue where the teenagers had positioned themselves, effectively blocking the main walkway that Frederick needed to use. As he approached, his weathered hands gripping his aluminum cane more tightly, Frederick could feel the familiar tension that preceded confrontation. 70 years of military experience had taught him to recognize when young men were looking for trouble, and every instinct warned him that these four were past the point of casual mischief. Jaden stepped deliberately into the center of the walkway, his posture aggressive and challenging. His backwards baseball cap cast shadows over eyes that held a dangerous combination of anger and desperation. Behind him, Sophia, Mason, and Logan formed a loose semicircle, blocking any alternate route Frederick might take around the memorial. "Excuse me, young man," Frederick said politely, his voice steady despite the arthritis pain shooting through his left hip. "I need to get through to reach the exit." Jaden looked Frederick up and down with obvious disdain, taking in the carefully pressed clothes, the aluminum cane, and the dignified bearing that marked him as someone from a different generation entirely. "Oh, you need to get through?" Jaden's voice dripped with mock concern. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to come strutting through our park." "Your park?" Frederick repeated, his tone remaining level despite the provocation. "This is a public space, son. Veterans Memorial Park belongs to the entire community." Sophia shifted uncomfortably, sensing the dangerous direction this conversation was taking. Her phone buzzed again with another message from her mother, but she ignored it, too focused on the unfolding drama to check her texts. Mason moved closer to Jaden, eager to demonstrate his loyalty to the group, while Logan remained slightly behind the others, his expression troubled. "Community?" Jaden laughed harshly. "Right, like this community gives a damn about people like us. When's the last time anyone in this precious community did anything to help kids from the wrong side of town?" Frederick studied the young man's face, recognizing the pain beneath the anger. He had seen that same expression on countless young Marines who had arrived at boot camp carrying the weight of difficult childhoods and broken promises. But military discipline had provided those young men with structure, purpose, and positive outlets for their frustration. "I understand you're upset about something," Frederick said carefully, but blocking pathways and intimidating elderly people isn't going to solve whatever problems you're facing. Intimidating. Jaden's voice rose, attracting attention from other park visitors who had begun to gather at a safe distance. We're just standing here, old man. You're the one making this into something bigger. Mason stepped forward, emboldened by Jaden's lead. Yeah, maybe you should show some respect for people your own age, instead of acting like you own this place. My own age. Frederick's eyebrows rose slightly. Son, when I was your age, I was fighting in World War II. I earned the right to walk through this park without being hassled by children who don't understand what sacrifice means. The mention of military service struck a nerve with Jaden, whose complicated relationship with his veteran father had left him with deep resentment toward anything connected to military culture. Oh great, another war hero, Jaden said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Let me guess, you single-handedly won the war, and now we're all supposed to bow down and thank you for your service. Sophia winced at Jaden's tone, remembering her uncle Diego, who had served in the military and always spoke respectfully about older veterans. Something about this confrontation felt wrong to her, but the group dynamics made it difficult to speak. Up without appearing weak or disloyal. I never asked for anyone to bow down, Frederick replied, his patience beginning to fray. I simply asked to be allowed to pass through a public walkway without harassment. Logan took a half-step backward, his conscience warring with his desire to maintain acceptance within the group. The old man's dignity and restraint reminded him painfully of his deceased grandfather, who had never raised his voice or shown disrespect to anyone, regardless of how they treated him. Harassment. Jaden moved closer to Frederick, invading his personal space in a clear act of intimidation. You want to see harassment, old-timer? This is just us having a conversation. A conversation requires mutual respect, Frederick said firmly. What you're doing right now is bullying, and I won't tolerate it. The word bullying struck Jaden like a physical blow. Throughout his childhood, he had been on the receiving end of bullying from older kids, teachers who favored students from better families, and a father whose own trauma manifested as verbal abuse. Being accused of bullying behavior forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about what he had become. Bullying. Jaden's face flushed with anger. You don't know anything about bullying, you old fool. You don't know what it's like to grow up in this town when your family doesn't matter, when nobody gives a damn whether you succeed or fail. Frederick felt a familiar stirring of protective instinct, the same feeling that had driven him to shield younger Marines from enemy fire or unfair treatment from incompetent officers. But this situation was different. He was outnumbered, physically, frail, and dealing with young people whose problems couldn't be solved through military discipline alone. Son, I've seen plenty of young men who felt like the world was against them, Frederick said, his voice softening slightly. The answer isn't taking your anger out on innocent people who have nothing to do with your problems. Innocent people? Mason jumped into the conversation, his voice shrill with adolescent indignation. You think you're innocent? Your generation screwed up everything and left us to deal with the mess. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, representing decades of generational conflict that had been building throughout American society. Frederick understood that these young people carried legitimate grievances about their economic prospects and social opportunities, but their approach to addressing those grievances was fundamentally flawed. Every generation faces challenges, Frederick said quietly. The difference is how you choose to respond to those challenges. You can become bitter and take your frustrations out on others, or you can find ways to make things better for yourselves and your community. Jaden felt his control over the situation slipping away. The old man's calm responses and reasonable tone were undermining his authority in front of his followers, making him appear petty and childish by comparison. Desperation drove him toward escalation. "Don't lecture me about making things better," Jaden snarled, moving so close to Frederick that their faces were only inches apart. "What have you ever done to make things better for people like us?" Frederick maintained eye contact, drawing on decades of experience dealing with hostile individuals in high-stress situations. "I spent 43 years in the Marine Corps, training young men to become leaders and defenders of freedom. Some of those young men came from backgrounds just like yours." The Marine Corps? Jaden's expression shifted, becoming even more hostile. "Great, another jarhead who thinks military service makes him special." The use of the derogatory term jarhead crossed a line that Frederick wasn't willing to tolerate. His posture straightened despite his age, and his voice took on the commanding tone that had once motivated Marines to follow him into combat. "Young man, you will speak with respect about the United States Marine Corps and the men and women who served this country with honor." The sudden authority in Frederick's voice startled all four teenagers, reminding them that beneath the frail exterior was a man who had commanded respect from some of the toughest warriors in American military history. For a moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Jaden made his choice. Or what, old man? Jaden shoved Frederick hard in the chest with both hands, sending the elderly veteran stumbling backward. "You gonna court-martial me?" Frederick's cane clattered to the ground as he struggled to maintain his balance, his 93-year-old reflexes no match for the sudden assault. Pain shot through his arthritic joints as he fought to stay upright, but Jaden wasn't finished. "Maybe you need a lesson in respect," Jaden continued, his voice rising to attract attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. Mason and Sophia exchanged worried glances, realizing that the situation had escalated beyond their comfort level, but neither felt confident enough to challenge Jaden's authority. Frederick bent slowly to retrieve his cane, his dignity intact, despite the physical assault. "Son, you're making a serious mistake. There are consequences for attacking elderly people regardless of your personal problems." "Consequences?" Jaden laughed bitterly. "The only consequence is that you finally learned your place. What happened next would haunt all four teenagers for the rest of their lives." Jaden grabbed Frederick by the shoulders, spun him around, and with the help of Mason, who acted on impulse rather than thought, they lifted the 93-year-old veteran and shoved him headfirst into the large metal trash can beside the memorial statue. The sound of Frederick's body hitting the bottom of the trash can echoed across the park like a gunshot. Gasps and cries of shock rose from the gathered onlookers as they witnessed an act of cruelty that defied comprehension. Frederick's legs protruded from the top of the trash can, his body wedged awkwardly inside among discarded food wrappers and empty bottles. Sophia stared in horror at what they had done, her hands covering her mouth as the full weight of their actions hit her. Logan backed away from the group, his face pale with shock and shame. Even Mason seemed stunned by the violence he had helped commit, but Jaden felt only a savage satisfaction as he looked down at the trash can containing the man who had dared to challenge his authority. "Now that's what I call taking out the trash," he said loudly, high-fiving Mason despite his reluctant response. The elderly veteran was trapped, humiliated, and possibly injured, surrounded by refuse while his attackers celebrated their cruelty. It was a moment that would define all their lives going forward, though none of them yet understood the full scope of the consequences they had set in motion. Unknown to the teenagers, their assault on Frederick Stevens had been witnessed by more than just shocked civilians. 3 blocks away, in the upper floors of the Springdale Municipal Building, a full Marine Reserve Battalion conducting urban warfare training exercises had clear sightlines to Veterans Memorial Park. Through high-powered scopes and binoculars, Marines had watched the entire incident unfold with growing anger and disbelief. 3 blocks away from Veterans Memorial Park, on the 4th floor of the Springdale Municipal Building, Colonel Michael Iron Peterson lowered his binoculars with hands that trembled slightly from controlled rage. The 45-year-old Marine Reserve Battalion commander had been conducting urban observation training with his Marines when they witnessed what would later be described in official reports as aggravated assault on an elderly veteran by multiple juvenile suspects. "Did you see what I just saw?" Colonel Peterson's voice carried the deadly calm that every Marine in the room recognized as barely contained fury. Captain Jason Murphy, positioned at the adjacent window with his own scope, confirmed the sighting. "Sir, 4 teenagers just assaulted an elderly male and forced him into a refuse container. Target appears to be injured and unable to extract himself." The municipal building had been selected for this training exercise precisely because its elevated position provided excellent sightlines across downtown Springdale. The Marines were practicing urban reconnaissance and target identification as part of their quarterly reserve training, using the busy streets and public spaces below as a realistic environment for honing their observational skills. Sergeant Major Diego Martinez stepped closer to the window, adjusting the focus on his spotting scope. His weathered face, marked by 26 years of military service, showed the kind of stone-cold anger that came from witnessing an unconscionable act against someone he instinctively recognized as a fellow warrior. "Colonel, that's not just any elderly male," Sergeant Major Martinez said, his voice tight with emotion. "Look at how he carries himself, even after that assault. That's a veteran, sir. I'd stake my career on it." Colonel Peterson raised his binoculars again, studying Frederick's bearing as the old man struggled inside the trash can. Even in his humiliated position, something about the way Frederick held his shoulders and moved his arms suggested military training that never fully leaves a person's muscle memory. "Corporal Foster, what's the status on emergency response?" Colonel Peterson barked. Corporal Brandon Foster, monitoring radio communications from his position near the communications equipment, responded immediately. "Sir, multiple civilians are calling 911. Estimated response time for Springdale PD and EMS is approximately 6 minutes." In the park below, Mrs. Eleanor Davis had called 911 from her cell phone while rushing toward the memorial statue as fast as her walker would allow. Other witnesses stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The sight of a 93-year-old man being stuffed into a trash can by teenagers defied their understanding of civilized behavior. "This is 911 emergency services." The dispatcher's voice came through Eleanor's phone. "There's been an assault at Veterans Memorial Park," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with outrage and fear. 4 teenagers just attacked an elderly man and put him in a trash can. "He's hurt and can't get out. Ma'am, I'm dispatching police and paramedics immediately. Are the attackers still on scene?" Eleanor looked toward the teenagers who were standing near the basketball court, acting as if nothing had happened. "Yes, they're still here. They're just standing around like they're proud of what they did." Back in the municipal building, the Marines continued their observation with professional intensity. Captain Murphy had shifted his scope to track the teenagers' movements, while other Marines documented the scene through digital cameras equipped with telephoto lenses. "Sir, the perpetrators appear to be celebrating," Captain Murphy reported. "Main suspect is a tall male, approximately 17 years old, wearing a backwards baseball cap. He's high-fiving one of his accomplices." Staff Sergeant Jennifer Hayes, one of only 3 female Marines in the battalion, focused her attention on Sophia Martinez. Her trained eye recognized the body language of someone experiencing deep regret and shame. Hunched shoulders, hands, a covering face, backing away from the group. "Colonel, one of the females in the group appears distressed by what happened," Staff Sergeant Hayes observed. She's displaying classic signs of moral conflict about participating in the assault. Colonel Peterson processed this information while calculating response options. His Marines were not law enforcement officers and had no legal authority to intervene directly in civilian criminal matters. However, they were sworn to protect and defend, and watching a veteran being brutalized by thugs tested every principle they held sacred. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson, what's our current training status? Colonel Peterson asked. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Bull Thompson, the battalion's senior training NCO, consulted his clipboard. Sir, we're scheduled for urban patrol exercises beginning at 1100 hours. Current time is 1047 hours. Reschedule the patrol exercises to begin immediately, Colonel Peterson ordered. We want a full squad ready to move in 5 minutes. We're conducting community relations training in Veterans Memorial Park. The euphemism fooled no one. Every Marine in the room understood that they were about to deliver a lesson in respect and consequences that those teenagers would never forget. The fact that their commanding officer was finding creative ways to justify their intervention only increased their admiration for his leadership. Down in the park, Frederick remained trapped. In the trash can, his body wedged at an awkward angle that put tremendous strain on his arthritic joints. The metal container was deeper than it appeared from the outside, and his 93-year-old muscles lacked the strength to pull himself free without assistance. Michael Kowalski, the park maintenance supervisor, arrived at the scene after receiving reports from visitors about the incident. A stocky man in his early 50s with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades of physical labor, Michael had maintained Veterans Memorial Park for over 15 years and took personal pride in keeping it a peaceful place for community gathering. "Dear God in heaven," Michael muttered as he approached the trash can. "Don't worry, sir, we're going to get you out of there." Working carefully to avoid causing further injury, Michael and 2 other adult males who had rushed to help began the delicate process of extracting Frederick from the container. The old man's weight made the task difficult, and his obvious pain indicated that the assault had aggravated existing health conditions. "Easy does it, sir," Michael said softly. "We've got you. Just try to relax and let us do the lifting." Frederick emerged from the trash can with food wrappers stuck to his clothing and garbage stains on his carefully pressed shirt. His silver hair was disheveled, and a small cut above his left eyebrow indicated that he had struck the bottom of the container with some force. But his eyes remained clear and alert, focusing immediately on the teenagers who had assaulted him. "Thank you," Frederick said quietly to his rescuers, accepting Michael's offer of support as he regained his footing. "I appreciate your kindness." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had been jogging through the park when the incident occurred, knelt beside Frederick to assess his condition. As an emergency physician at St. Mary's Medical Center, she was qualified to provide immediate medical evaluation. "Sir, I'm Dr. Mitchell. Can you tell me where you're experiencing pain?" she asked, gently checking his pulse and looking for signs of serious injury. "My left hip is quite sore, and I have some discomfort in my ribs," Frederick replied honestly. "Nothing. That feels broken, but definitely aggravated by the fall." Dr. Mitchell nodded, continuing her examination. "We should have paramedics here shortly to transport you to the hospital for x-rays and a complete evaluation. At your age, any fall can cause complications that aren't immediately apparent." The teenagers had moved away from the memorial statue, but remained in the park, their reactions varying dramatically. Jaden maintained his defiant posture, occasionally glancing toward Frederick with satisfaction rather than remorse. Mason appeared increasingly uncomfortable as the reality of their actions sank in, while Logan had distanced himself from the group and was staring at the ground. Sophia finally approached the group of adults helping Frederick, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Is he okay?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the growing commotion in the park. Eleanor Davis turned towards Sophia with an expression of profound disappointment and anger. "Young lady, how could you participate in something so cruel? That man is 93 years old and served our country with honor." "I didn't know he was a veteran," Sophia whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We didn't mean for it to go that far. Didn't mean for it to go that far." Eleanor's voice rose in indignation. "You put an elderly man in a trash can. What exactly did you think would happen?" Dr. Mitchell looked up from her examination of Frederick. "This man has injuries consistent with being violently assaulted. Whoever did this is looking at serious criminal charges." The arrival of Springdale Police Department units, their sirens cutting through the morning air, marked the beginning of official consequences for the teenagers' actions. Detective Mark Thompson, a 41-year-old veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience, emerged from the lead patrol car and immediately began securing the scene. "I need everyone to stay exactly where they are," Detective Thompson announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "We have multiple witnesses to a serious assault, and nobody leaves until we sort this out." Officer Lisa Rodriguez approached the teenagers while Detective Thompson spoke with Frederick and the civilian witnesses. Her training had taught her to separate suspects quickly to prevent them from coordinating their stories or disposing of evidence. "You four, hands where I can see them," Officer Rodriguez commanded. "You're being detained pending investigation of assault charges." Jaden's bravado finally began to crack as the full weight of legal consequences became apparent. "We were just messing around," he protested. "It's not like we seriously hurt him or anything." "Sir, that 93-year-old man required assistance to get out of a trash can where you put him," Officer Rodriguez replied coldly. "That constitutes aggravated assault on an elderly person, which is a felony in the state of Arkansas. As the police began their investigation and paramedics arrived to transport Frederick to the hospital, none of the participants in this drama were aware that their actions had triggered a military response that was already in motion. 3 blocks away, Marine Reserve Battalion members were gathering their equipment and preparing to deliver their own form of justice to 4 teenagers who had forgotten that respect for veterans isn't optional in communities where honor still matters. The sound of military boots moving in perfect synchronization echoed down Main Street as 12 Marines from Colonel Peterson's Reserve Battalion approached Veterans Memorial Park. Their formation was precise, disciplined, and unmistakably intimidating, not the casual patrol of peacetime soldiers, but the measured advance of warriors who had witnessed an unforgivable act against one of their own. Colonel Peterson led the formation, his service Charlie uniform immaculate, and his bearing radiating the kind of authority that comes from commanding respect in the world's most dangerous places. Behind him, Sergeant Major Diego Martinez matched his stride, while Captain Murphy, Staff Sergeant Hayes, and 8 other Marines maintained perfect spacing as they covered the 3 blocks from the municipal building to the park. Detective Thompson looked up from his interview with Frederick to see the approaching Marines, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding as he recognized the unmistakable purpose in their movement. As a 20-year police veteran who had worked with military personnel on various occasions, he understood that something significant was about to happen. "Officer Rodriguez," Detective Thompson called to his partner. "We're about to have company." The teenagers, still standing under police supervision near the basketball court, turned to see the Marine formation entering the park. Jaden's confident demeanor faltered for the first time since the assault, while Mason took an involuntary step backward. Logan's face went pale as he counted the number of Marines heading directly toward them, and Sophia felt her stomach drop as she recognized something familiar about one of the approaching figures. "Holy shit," Jaden whispered, his voice carrying none of its earlier bravado. "What are Marines doing here?" "Language," Officer Rodriguez snapped automatically, but her attention was focused on the approaching military personnel and the potential complications their presence might create. Colonel Peterson approached Detective Thompson with the crisp efficiency of a man accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic obstacles. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his tone respectful but unmistakably determined. "Detective Thompson, I'm Colonel Peterson, Marine Reserve Battalion 324. We witnessed the assault on the elderly veteran from our training position in the municipal building. I'm here to offer assistance and ensure this matter receives appropriate attention." Detective Thompson nodded, recognizing both the courtesy and the implicit warning in the Colonel's words. "Colonel, I appreciate your concern. We have the situation under control and the suspects are being processed according to standard procedures." "I'm sure you do, Detective," Colonel Peterson replied smoothly. "However, when Marines witness an assault on a veteran, we consider it our duty to ensure that all available information is properly documented. We have multiple trained observers who can provide detailed witness statements." While the two men spoke, Sergeant Major Martinez had positioned himself where he could clearly observe the teenagers. His trained eye took in their body language, their relative positions, and most importantly, their individual reactions to the military presence. When his gaze fell on Sophia, recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Sophia?" Sergeant Major Martinez's voice carried shock, disappointment, and a deep personal pain that cut through the professional military bearing he had maintained throughout his career. Sophia's head snapped up at the sound of her name, her eyes widening as she saw her uncle Diego for the first time in over 2 years. The last time they had spoken, it had been at a family gathering that ended in a bitter argument between him and her mother about military service, personal responsibility, and the direction Sophia's life was taking. "Uncle Diego." Sophia's voice was barely a whisper, her face flushing with shame as she realized that her estranged uncle had witnessed her participation in the assault. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the police officers and the remaining Marines. Staff Sergeant Hayes exchanged glances with Captain Murphy, while Corporal Foster and the other Marines maintained their professional composure despite the obvious personal connection. "You know this girl, Sergeant Major?" Colonel Peterson asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Sir, she's my niece," Sergeant Major Martinez replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I haven't seen her in 2 years, since her mother decided that military influence was unwelcome in their household." Detective Thompson looked between the Marine and the teenager, recognizing the complex family dynamics that were suddenly complicating his investigation. "Sergeant Major, I need to ask if this personal connection affects your ability to provide objective witness testimony." "Detective, my personal feelings don't change what I observed through my spotting scope," Sergeant Major Martinez replied. Firmly, "I watched my niece participate in the assault of a 93-year-old veteran. Those are the facts, regardless of my relationship to one of the perpetrators." Jaden, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "Look, we didn't know he was a veteran, okay? It was just a stupid prank that got out of hand." Colonel Peterson turned his attention to Jaden with the kind of focused intensity that had once motivated Marines to follow him into combat zones. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Son, ignorance is not an excuse for assaulting an elderly person. But since you claim you didn't know he was a veteran, let me educate you about who you attacked." The colonel gestured toward Frederick, who was being loaded onto a stretcher by paramedics but had refused to leave until he could hear what the Marines had to say. That man served 43 years in the United States Marine Corps. He fought in World War II when he was younger than you are now. He survived the Pacific Theater, Korea, and Vietnam. He trained thousands of young Marines to defend freedom and democracy, and you put him in a trash can because you were bored. The weight of Frederick's service record hung in the air like an indictment. Even Jaden, with all his resentment toward authority figures, could not dismiss the magnitude of what they had done to someone who had sacrificed so much for his country. Mason finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "We're sorry. We didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." "Sorry?" Staff Sergeant Hayes stepped forward, her voice cutting through Mason's attempt at an apology. "You're sorry? That man gave his entire adult life to protecting the freedoms you take for granted, and you humiliated him for entertainment." Logan, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face as the full weight of their actions hit him. "My grandfather was a veteran," Logan said through his sobs. "He would be so ashamed of what I did. He always told me to respect people who served, and I helped put that man in a trash can." Captain Murphy observed Logan's genuine remorse while maintaining his professional bearing. In his 8 years as a Marine officer, he had learned to distinguish between performative regret and authentic guilt. Logan's reaction appeared genuine, suggesting that not all the teenagers were equally committed to their destructive behavior. Sophia approached her uncle slowly, her own tears mixing with the shame that threatened to overwhelm her. "Uncle Diego, I'm so sorry. I know what I did was wrong. I know you're disappointed in me." Sergeant Major Martinez looked at his niece with an expression that combined love, disappointment, and profound sadness. "Sophia, I'm not just disappointed. I'm heartbroken. Your mother may not want military influence in your life, but I had hoped you would understand the values we represent." "I do understand," Sophia whispered. "I lost sight of them, but I understand now." Detective Thompson cleared his throat, recognizing that while the family drama was compelling, he still had a criminal investigation to complete. "Colonel, I appreciate your team's witness statements, but I need to continue processing these suspects according to departmental procedures." "Of course, Detective," Colonel Peterson replied. "However, I would like to request that these young people understand the full impact of their actions. With your permission, I'd like to arrange for them to meet some of the veterans who use this park regularly." "That sounds like something for the court system to decide," Detective Thompson said diplomatically. "Right now, I need to transport these suspects to the station for formal booking." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Frederick Stevens called out from the stretcher where paramedics were securing him for transport to the hospital. "Colonel Peterson, if I may have a word." The Marine officer approached the stretcher, snapping to attention as he neared the elderly veteran. Despite his injuries and humiliation, Frederick maintained the bearing that marked him as a fellow warrior. "Colonel, these are young people who have lost their way," Frederick said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent decades training troubled youth. "They need guidance, not just punishment. If the courts allow it, I'd like to be involved in helping them understand what service and sacrifice really mean." Colonel Peterson studied Frederick's face, seeing in it the same commitment to developing young people that had driven his own career as a Marine leader. "Sir, with respect, they assaulted you. You don't owe them anything." "Colonel, that's exactly why I do owe them something," Frederick replied. "Every young person deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes and become better than they were. These 4 just made a very serious mistake, but they're not beyond redemption." The paramedics began moving Frederick toward the ambulance, but his words lingered in the air, challenging everyone present to consider the difference between justice and revenge, between punishment and education. As the police loaded the teenagers into patrol cars for transport to the station, the Marines remained in formation, their presence serving as a reminder that some actions carry consequences that extend far beyond the legal system. The assault on Frederick Stevens had awakened something in the military community that would not be easily satisfied by standard judicial procedures. Sergeant Major Martinez watched his niece being placed in the back of a police car, his heart breaking for the pain his family would endure, but his duty clear about the consequences that needed to follow. Sometimes love requires allowing people to face the full weight of their choices, even when it hurts everyone involved. The Springdale County Courthouse buzzed with unusual activity for a Wednesday morning as news of the veteran assault spread. Through the small Arkansas community, Judge Patricia Henderson, a 55-year-old magistrate with 23 years on the bench, had seen plenty of juvenile cases during her career, but nothing quite like the charges being filed against 4 local teenagers for aggravated assault on a 93-year-old war veteran. Your Honor, the state of Arkansas charges Jaden Williams, age 17, with aggravated assault on an elderly person, a Class B felony, District Attorney Michelle Carter announced as she read the formal charges. Her voice carried the weight of someone who understood that this case would define her office's commitment to protecting vulnerable community members. Judge Henderson studied the 4 teenagers standing before her bench, taking in their varying expressions of defiance, fear, and remorse. Her experience had taught her to look beyond the surface of juvenile behavior to identify the underlying issues that led young people to make destructive choices. Mr. Williams, do you understand the charges being filed against you? Judge Henderson asked, her tone firm but not harsh. Jaden stood straighter, his public defender Alan Stewart beside him, but his earlier bravado had completely evaporated in the formal setting of the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, he replied quietly. And do you understand that aggravated assault on an elderly person is a felony that carries a potential sentence of 3 to 10 years in state prison? The weight of those words hit Jaden like a physical blow. 3 to 10 years. He would be in his 20s before he got out, his entire future destroyed by 15 minutes of anger and stupidity in Veterans Memorial Park. Yes, Your Honor, Jaden repeated, his voice barely audible. Judge Henderson turned her attention to the other 3 defendants. Miss Martinez, Mr. Carter, Mr. Brooks, you are each charged as accessories to aggravated assault. Do you understand these charges? Yes, Your Honor, they replied in unison, though their individual reactions varied dramatically. Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the judge's gaze, while Mason fidgeted nervously with his hands. Logan appeared to be fighting back tears. Public Defender Alan Stewart stepped forward to address the court. Your Honor, my clients are all first-time offenders with no prior criminal history. We request that they be released to their parents pending trial. District Attorney Carter objected immediately. Your Honor, the defendants committed a heinous act of violence against a decorated military veteran. The community demands accountability, and we believe they represent a flight risk. The community, Judge Henderson said slowly, also includes the families of these defendants. I want to hear from the parents before making any decisions about custody. Kenneth Williams Sr. stood up in the gallery, his Marine dress uniform impeccable despite the obvious stress of seeing his son in custody. The ribbons and decorations on his chest told the story of 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, but the pain in his eyes spoke to a different kind of battle. The struggle of raising a troubled teenager while dealing with his own post-traumatic stress. Your Honor, I'm Staff Sergeant Kenneth Williams, United States Marine Corps. That boy is my son, and I take full responsibility for his actions. Judge Henderson studied the veteran's bearing, recognizing the military discipline that had shaped his character. Sergeant Williams, how do you explain your son's assault on a fellow veteran? Kenneth's jaw tightened as he struggled with the shame of his son's actions. Your Honor, I've been dealing with some personal issues since returning from deployment. My marriage to Jaden's mother has been difficult, and I'm afraid my son has absorbed more of my anger and frustration than I realized. That's no excuse for what he did, Judge Henderson replied firmly. No, Your Honor, it's not, Kenneth agreed, but it might explain how he learned to express his anger through violence instead of seeking help through proper channels. Isabella, Martinez stood up next, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from the overnight shift she had worked before rushing to the courthouse. As Sophia's mother, she carried the additional burden of knowing that her estranged brother Diego had witnessed her daughter's participation in the assault. Your Honor, I'm Isabella Martinez, Sophia's mother. I work 2 jobs to support my family, and I'm afraid I haven't been available to provide the guidance my daughter needed. Mrs. Martinez, your daughter participated in assaulting a 93-year-old, a veteran, Judge Henderson said. What steps have you taken to address her behavior problems? Isabella's voice trembled as she replied. Your Honor, I didn't know she was having behavior problems. She helps take care of her younger sister while I work, and her grades have been acceptable. I thought she was doing well. The judge turned to Robert and Linda Carter, Mason's parents, who sat together despite the obvious tension between them. Robert's construction clothes contrasted sharply with Linda's professional nursing attire, highlighting the different worlds they inhabited even within their own marriage. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, your son helped assault an elderly veteran. How do you explain his involvement in this incident? Robert Carter stood slowly, his weathered hands showing the calluses of 20 years in construction work. Your Honor, my wife and I have been having marital difficulties. Mason has been caught in the middle of our problems, and I think he was looking for acceptance from the wrong crowd. Linda Carter wiped tears from her eyes as she added, We've been so focused on our own problems that we missed the signs that Mason was struggling. We failed him, and now an innocent man has been hurt because of our failures as parents. Richard and Sharon Brooks remained seated when the judge looked in their direction, their faces showing the exhaustion of small business owners struggling to keep their restaurant afloat while raising a family. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, I don't see you standing, Judge Henderson observed. Richard Brooks stood reluctantly, his voice heavy with defeat. Your Honor, our son Logan has always been a good kid. We don't understand how he got involved in something like this. Our business has been struggling, and we've both been working 16-hour days just to keep our doors open. Hard work doesn't excuse neglecting your parental responsibilities, Judge Henderson replied sternly. No, Your Honor, it doesn't, Sharon. Brooks said, finally standing beside her husband, We love our son, but we realize now that love isn't enough without time and attention. Judge Henderson studied the families before her, recognizing patterns she had seen throughout her career, economic stress, family dysfunction, and the breakdown of communication that often preceded juvenile criminal behavior. But she also understood. That explanation was not the same as excuse. Ladies and gentlemen, your children committed a serious felony against a war veteran who served this country for over 4 decades. The victim, Master Sergeant Frederick Stevens, fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He trained young Marines to defend freedom and democracy, and your children put him in a trash can for entertainment. The stark summary of the assault hung in the courtroom like an indictment of everyone present. Parents shifted uncomfortably as the full weight of their children's actions was laid bare in simple, undeniable terms. However, Judge Henderson continued, Master Sergeant Stevens has contacted this court with an unusual request. He has asked to be involved in determining appropriate consequences for your children, and he has specifically requested that punishment be combined with education. District Attorney Carter looked surprised by this development. Your Honor, the victim wants to participate in sentencing. More than participate, Ms. Carter. Master Sergeant Stevens has proposed a rehabilitation program that would require these young people to complete community service specifically focused on helping elderly veterans in our community. Public Defender Stewart seized on this opportunity. Your Honor, my clients would be honored to participate in any program that Master Sergeant Stevens recommends. Mr. Stewart, your clients will participate in whatever program this court deems appropriate, Judge Henderson corrected. The question is whether they understand the gravity of their actions and are genuinely committed to making amends. She turned her attention back to the 4 teenagers. I want each of you to tell me, in your own words, what you did wrong and why it matters. Logan Brooks stepped forward first, tears streaming down his face. Your Honor, I helped hurt an old man who never did anything to deserve it. My grandfather was a veteran, and he taught me to respect people who served our country. I forgot everything he taught me, and I'm ashamed of what I became. Mason Carter spoke next, his voice shaking. With emotion, Your Honor, I got caught up in group pressure and did something terrible to someone who spent his life protecting people like me. I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I want to find a way to make it right. Sofia Martinez looked toward the gallery where her uncle Diego sat in his Marine uniform, then back to the judge. Your Honor, I dishonored my family and everything my uncle taught me about service and sacrifice. I participated in hurting someone who deserved respect, not cruelty. Finally, Judge Henderson turned to Jaden Williams, whose leadership had initiated the assault. Mr. Williams? Jaden struggled to find words that could express the magnitude of his realization. Your Honor, I was angry about things that had nothing to do with that old man, and I took my anger out on someone who didn't deserve it. I attacked a war hero because I was too stupid and selfish to deal with my own problems. Judge Henderson studied each teenager's expression, using her decades of experience to assess the sincerity of their statements. What she saw was 4 young people who had finally grasped the enormity of what they had done, though their individual paths to that understanding varied significantly. I am releasing you to your parents' custody pending trial, Judge Henderson announced. However, you will each undergo psychological evaluation, perform 200 hours of community service with elderly veterans, and participate in Master Sergeant Stevens' rehabilitation program when he is released from the hospital. Thank you, Your Honor, the teenagers said together. Don't thank me yet, Judge Henderson warned. If any of you violate the terms of your release, or if you fail to complete the rehabilitation program to Master Sergeant Stevens' satisfaction, you will serve the maximum sentence allowed by law. Court is adjourned. As the families filed out of the courtroom, the weight of redemption and the long road toward earning forgiveness settled on everyone involved. The teenagers had taken their first steps toward understanding the true cost of their actions. But the real work of making amends was just beginning. 2 weeks after the assault, Frederick Stevens sat in his small apartment overlooking Main Street, carefully reviewing the rehabilitation program he had designed for the 4 teenagers. His left hip still ached from the injuries sustained in the trash can incident, and his ribs remained tender, but his mind was sharp and focused on the task of transforming 4 young lives through understanding and service. The living room walls displayed decades of military memorabilia, framed photographs of Marine units, service ribbons mounted in shadow boxes, and letters from former students who had gone on to successful military careers. Frederick had spent the past 14 days in the hospital and recovery, but rather than dwelling on his injuries, he had used the time to develop a comprehensive program that would challenge the teenagers to confront their actions while learning about sacrifice and service. A knock at the door interrupted his planning. Frederick rose slowly, using his aluminum cane for support, and opened the door to find Colonel Peterson and Sergeant Major Martinez standing in the hallway. Master Sergeant Stevens, Colonel Peterson said, snapping to attention. How are you feeling, sir? Please come in, Colonel, Frederick replied, gesturing them into his modest living room. I'm feeling well enough to begin the work that needs to be done. Sergeant Major Martinez remained standing until Frederick settled into his favorite armchair. A gesture of respect that reflected military protocol, even in civilian settings. Sir, we wanted to discuss the rehabilitation program you've proposed. Some members of the community are questioning whether these kids deserve a second chance. Frederick nodded thoughtfully. Sergeant Major, I've spent 70 years working with young people who had lost their way. In my experience, punishment without education rarely produces lasting change. These four need to understand what they damaged, not just face consequences for their actions. Colonel Peterson leaned forward in his chair. Master Sergeant, with respect, they assaulted you. Nobody would blame you for wanting them to face the full penalty under law. Colonel, if I wanted revenge, I'd let the justice system run its course, Frederick replied firmly. But revenge doesn't heal communities or transform lives. These young people need to understand what service means, what sacrifice looks like, and why respecting our elders matters to the fabric of society. The three men spent the next hour reviewing Frederick's detailed program plan. Each teenager would be assigned to work with different elderly veterans in the community, learning about their service while providing practical assistance with daily tasks. The program would include structured discussions about military history, personal responsibility, and community service. Jaden Williams will work with Frank Sullivan, Frederick explained, consulting his handwritten notes. Frank's 88 years old, served in Korea, and doesn't suffer fools gladly. If anyone can break through that boy's anger and resentment, it's Frank. What about the girl, my niece? Sergeant Major Martinez asked, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and concern. Sophia will be assigned to help Raymond Washington, Frederick replied. Doc 74 served 2 tours in Vietnam as a medic, and he understands the burden of carrying guilt. She needs to learn that making mistakes doesn't define you. How you respond to those mistakes does. At Springdale Community Center, the following Monday morning, the 4 teenagers gathered for their first day of the rehabilitation program. The building's multi-purpose room had been configured with folding chairs arranged in a circle, and several elderly veterans sat waiting with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Frank Bulldog Sullivan sat ramrod straight in his wheelchair, his Korean War veteran cap precisely positioned and his weathered hands folded in his lap. At 88, his body showed the wear of age and combat injuries, but his eyes remained sharp and intelligent. He studied Jaden Williams with the calculating gaze of someone who had commanded respect from much tougher men than troubled teenagers. "So you're the young punk who put Falcon in a trash can," Frank said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. "Tell me, son, what exactly was going through your head when you decided to assault?" A 93-year-old war veteran, Jaden shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unprepared for such direct confrontation. "Mr. Sullivan, I was angry about things that had nothing to do with him." "Mr. Sullivan," Frank's eyebrows rose. "Boy, I'm Sergeant Sullivan to you. I didn't spend 2 years fighting Chinese communists in Korea so some punk kid could disrespect me with civilian titles." "Yes, Sergeant Sullivan," Jaden replied quickly, recognizing that his usual defiance would not work with this particular authority figure. Across the circle, Raymond Doc Washington studied Sophia with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades treating wounded soldiers. His dark skin showed the lines of age and experience, while his gentle demeanor masked the steel that had enabled him to function under fire in Vietnam's jungles. "Miss Martinez, your uncle tells me you've been carrying some heavy guilt since the incident," Doc said softly. "In Vietnam, I treated a lot of young soldiers who had to live with things they'd done in the heat of battle. The guilt can eat you alive if you let it." Sophia looked up from her hands, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "I keep thinking about what my grandfather would say if he knew what I did. He always taught me to respect people who served. You're Grandfather was a wise man, Doc replied, but wisdom includes understanding that good people sometimes make terrible mistakes. The question is what you're going to do with the lessons those mistakes teach you. Mason Carter found himself paired with Harold Jenkins, a 73-year-old Navy veteran who had served on destroyers during the Cold War. Harold's no-nonsense approach to life came from decades of maintaining complex machinery under stressful conditions, and he had little patience for excuses or self-pity. "Carter, your folks tell me you've been having problems with authority figures," Harold said, consulting a clipboard with notes about each teenager's background. "In the Navy, we had a saying, ship, shipmate, self. That's the order of priorities. That keeps everyone alive and functional." "I don't understand," Mason admitted. "It means you put the mission first, your teammates second, and yourself last," Harold explained. "When you assaulted that old Marine, you put yourself first, ignored your responsibility to your community, and damaged your teammates in the process." Logan Brooks sat quietly next to Eleanor Davis, the 78-year-old woman who had called 911 during the assault. Unlike the other veterans, Eleanor had volunteered specifically to work with Logan because she recognized something in his demeanor that reminded her of her own grandson. "Logan, I watched you during the incident in the park," Eleanor said gently. "You didn't want to be there, did you?" Logan's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to answer. "No, ma'am. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop it without losing the only friends I had." "Honey, friends don't ask you to compromise your values," Eleanor replied. "Real friends help you become the person you're meant to be, not drag you down to their level." Frederick entered the room using his cane for support, immediately commanding attention from everyone present. Despite his injuries and advanced age, his bearing still radiated the authority that had made him an effective leader throughout his military career. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered here because 4 young people made a serious mistake that hurt not just me, but our entire community," Frederick began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Over the next 12 weeks, these teenagers will learn about service, sacrifice, and the importance of treating our elders with respect." He turned his attention to the 4 teenagers. "You will each spend 30 hours per week working with your assigned veteran. You'll help with grocery shopping, yard work, medical appointments, and household maintenance. But more importantly, you'll listen to their stories and learn about the sacrifices they made for the freedoms you take for granted." Jaden raised his hand hesitantly. "Master Sergeant Stevens, what if we mess up again?" Frederick studied the young man's face, seeing genuine concern beneath the question. "Son, making mistakes is part of learning. The goal isn't perfection, it's growth. But if you choose to repeat the same destructive patterns, you'll face the full consequences that Judge Henderson promised." Sophia spoke up next. "So how do we know if we're doing enough to make up for what we did?" "Miss Martinez, you can't make up for assault by performing community service," Frederick replied honestly. "What you can do is demonstrate that you've learned from your mistakes and committed yourself to becoming better people. The veterans in this room will decide whether your efforts are genuine." Frank Sullivan leaned forward in his wheelchair, fixing Jaden with an intense stare. "Williams, you want to know what genuine effort looks like? Tomorrow morning you'll be at my apartment at 0700 hours. We're going to clean out my garage, organize my military memorabilia, and then you're going to listen while I tell you about real fighting men who died so you could have the luxury of being angry about trivial problems." Doc Washington nodded approvingly. "Sophia, we'll start with helping me organize medical supplies for the VFW's Veteran Assistance Program. You'll learn about the wounds that don't always heal and the responsibility we have to take care of each other." Harold Jenkins consulted his clipboard again. Carter, my basement flooded last month and damaged some of my Navy records. We're going to restore what can be saved and learn about the importance of preserving history for future generations." Eleanor Davis smiled at Logan. "Young man, we're going to visit some of the elderly veterans who can't leave their homes anymore. You'll see what loneliness looks like and understand why community connection matters so much." Frederick watched the interactions between the veterans and teenagers, recognizing the careful matching of personalities and needs that would maximize the program's effectiveness. Each pairing had been designed to address specific character flaws, while building on existing strengths. One final point, Frederick announced as the session concluded. "This program is voluntary. Judge Henderson's court order requires community service, but participating in our rehabilitation program is your choice. Anyone who wants to serve their hours picking up trash or painting over graffiti can make that request." The four teenagers exchanged glances, weighing their options. Traditional community service would be easier, requiring no emotional investment or personal growth. But something about the dignity and wisdom of the veterans in the room made that choice feel like a missed opportunity. "We want to stay in the program," Logan said quietly, speaking for the group. "Good," Frederick replied, "because tomorrow your real education begins." As the meeting ended and participants began filing out of the community center, the weight of genuine transformation settled over everyone involved. The teenagers were about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, while the veterans prepared to share wisdom earned through decades of service and sacrifice. For the first time since the assault, real healing seemed possible. 6 weeks into the rehabilitation program, the transformation in the four teenagers was becoming visible to everyone in Springdale. What had begun as court-ordered community service had evolved into something deeper, genuine relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The change wasn't immediate or easy, but it was unmistakable. Jaden Williams arrived at Frank Sullivan's apartment complex at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, his punctuality a dramatic departure from the casual disregard for schedules that had characterized his previous behavior. The 88-year-old Korean War veteran sat in his wheelchair on the apartment's small balcony, sipping coffee from a Marine Corps mug and watching the sunrise paint the Arkansas sky in shades of gold and pink. "On time again, Williams," Frank observed without turning around. 6 weeks ago, I would have bet good money that you'd never learn basic discipline." "Sergeant Sullivan, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jaden said as he unlocked the storage unit they had been organizing for the past month. "About the Marines who didn't make it home from Korea." Frank maneuvered his wheelchair to face Jaden directly. "What about them, son?" "You said some of them were younger than me when they died," Jaden continued, carefully lifting a box of military records from the storage unit. "I keep wondering what they would think about how I was wasting my life before this program started." The storage unit had become a symbol of Frank's entire military career. Decades of carefully preserved documents, photographs, and mementos that told the story of a young farm boy who had answered his country's call and spent 2 years fighting in brutal conditions most Americans could never imagine. For the past month, Jaden had been helping Frank organize these materials for donation to the local historical society. "Williams, those boys died believing that their sacrifice meant something," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of memories that had haunted him for over 60 years. "They died believing that future generations would understand the cost of freedom and treat it with respect." Jaden paused in his work, a faded photograph in his hands showing Frank and his Marine unit in Korea. The young faces in the picture were filled with determination and courage, but Frank had told him that half of those Marines never made it home alive. "Sergeant Sullivan, I think I understand now why you were so angry when I disrespected Master Sergeant Stevens," Jaden said quietly. "When I attacked him, I was attacking everything those Marines died for. Frank studied Jaden's expression, recognizing genuine understanding rather than the performative remorse that had characterized his early weeks in the program. Son, understanding is the first step. The second step is making sure you never forget that understanding, even when life gets difficult again. Across town, Sophia Martinez sat in Raymond Washington's small kitchen, carefully sorting medical supplies for the VFW's Veteran Assistance Program. The 74-year-old Vietnam veteran moved slowly around the kitchen, preparing lunch for both of them, while sharing stories about his service as a field medic in one of America's most controversial wars. "Doc, can I ask you something personal?" Sophia said, looking up from the boxes of bandages and medications she was organizing. "Sophia, after 6 weeks of working together, I think we're past the point of worrying about personal questions," Doc replied with a gentle smile. "What's on your mind? You've told me about saving lives in Vietnam, but you've never talked about the people you couldn't save," Sophia said carefully. "I know from my uncle Diego that medics sometimes had to make impossible choices." Doc paused. In his meal preparation, his hands stilling as memories from 50 years ago surfaced with painful clarity. "Child, some conversations change you forever. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of talk?" Sophia nodded seriously. "I think I need to understand what real guilt looks like, so I can figure out how to handle what I'm carrying." Doc sat down his cooking utensils and joined Sophia at the kitchen table, his expression showing the careful consideration of someone who had learned to weigh his words before speaking about traumatic experiences. "In Vietnam, I lost 19 boys that I couldn't save," Doc said quietly. 19 young men who called for their mothers, while I held pressure on wounds that were too severe for field treatment. For 30 years after the war, I carried guilt about not being able to do more. "How did you get past it?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I learned that guilt is only useful if it motivates you to do better in the future," Doc replied. "Destructive guilt focuses on what you can't change. Constructive guilt drives you to make better choices going forward." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Doc's front door. Sophia rose to answer it, finding an elderly woman struggling with several bags of groceries. Without hesitation, Sophia helped carry the bags inside and introduced herself to Mrs. Catherine O'Brien, Doc's 91-year-old neighbor who lived alone. "Catherine, this is Sophia, the young lady I've been telling you about," Doc said, gesturing for their unexpected visitor to join them at the table. "Sophia, Mrs. O'Brien lost her husband in World War II. He was killed at Normandy when she was only 23 years old." Catherine O'Brien studied Sophia with eyes that held decades of wisdom and sorrow. "Young lady, Doc tells me you're learning about making amends for past mistakes." "Yes, ma'am," Sophia replied respectfully. "I did something terrible to a veteran, and I'm trying to understand how to make it right." "Child, I've lived through the Depression, a world war, and 60 years of widowhood," Catherine said firmly. "What I've learned is that making amends isn't about earning forgiveness. It's about becoming someone worthy of the second chances you've been given." Meanwhile, at Harold Jenkins' house across town, Mason Carter was discovering that physical work could be both challenging and rewarding. The Navy veteran's basement had suffered significant water damage during spring flooding, destroying decades of carefully preserved military records and personal memorabilia. "Carter, hand me that hairdryer," Harold instructed as they worked to salvage photographs from his naval service. "Some of these pictures are the only copies in existence." Mason carefully passed the hairdryer to Harold, who had developed an intricate system for drying and preserving water-damaged documents. The process was tedious and time-consuming, but it had given both men hours of conversation about military service, personal responsibility, and the importance of preserving history. "Mr. Jenkins, why do you care so much about saving these old Papers? Mason asked, genuinely curious. I mean, the important stuff is probably recorded in official military files somewhere. Harold looked up from a faded photograph showing his destroyer in the Mediterranean Sea during the 1960s. Son, official files, record facts, dates, locations, unit assignments. These personal records capture the human experience of service. They remind us that military history isn't just about battles and strategy. It's about young people making sacrifices for something bigger than themselves. The photograph Harold was working to restore showed him and his shipmates during a port call in Italy. The young sailors in the picture were laughing and celebrating, but Harold had told Mason that 2 of them died in accidents before the deployment ended. Carter, when I was your age, I thought military service was just a job. Harold continued, it took me years to understand that wearing the uniform meant accepting responsibility for protecting people who might never know your name or appreciate your sacrifice. Mason carefully organized the dried documents according to Harold's filing system, his movements more deliberate and respectful than they had been during his first weeks in the program. Mr. Jenkins, do you think Master Sergeant Stevens sees any real change in us, or is he just being patient because that's what good leaders do? Harold studied Mason's expression, recognizing the genuine concern behind the question. Son, Falcon. Stevens has trained thousands of young Marines during his career. He knows the difference between performance and genuine transformation. If he's investing his time in this program, it's because he sees potential worth developing. At Eleanor Davis's apartment, Logan Brooks was learning lessons about loneliness and community connection that would shape his understanding of human relationships for the rest of his life. The 78-year-old widow had become his guide to the hidden world of elderly veterans who rarely left their homes, introducing him to men and women whose service and sacrifice had been largely forgotten by their community. Logan, today we're visiting Arthur Kowalski, Eleanor explained as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor of a subsidized housing complex. He's 94, served in World War II, and hasn't had a visitor in over 2 months. Arthur Kowalski answered his door slowly, using a walker for support and squinting at his visitors through thick glasses. His small apartment was neat but sparse, containing only the essential furniture and a few military mementos from his service in the European theater. Arthur, this is Logan, the young man I've been telling you about, Eleanor said gently. He's here to help with anything you might need. Arthur studied Logan with the careful attention of someone who had learned to be cautious around strangers. Young man, Eleanor tells me you're working with veterans as part of some kind of community service program. Yes, sir, Logan replied, respectfully. I made some serious mistakes, and I'm trying to learn how to be a better person. What kind of mistakes? Arthur asked directly. Logan took a deep breath before answering. Mr. Kowalski, I helped assault a 93-year-old veteran. We put him in a trash can because we thought it was funny. Arthur's expression shifted from caution to shock, then to a sadness so profound that Logan felt his eyes filling with tears. The elderly veteran lowered himself into his chair with obvious effort, his hands shaking slightly as he processed Logan's confession. Son, why would you hurt someone who served? Arthur asked quietly. Sir, I was angry about things in my life that had nothing to do with him, Logan replied honestly. I was looking for acceptance from friends who weren't really friends, and I lost sight of everything my grandfather taught me about respecting veterans. Arthur nodded slowly, his expression softening as he recognized the genuine remorse in Logan's voice. Your grandfather was a veteran. Yes, sir. He served in Vietnam and always told me that veterans were special people who deserved respect. Logan said, his voice breaking slightly. He would be so ashamed of what I did. Eleanor moved to sit beside Arthur, her presence providing comfort to both the elderly veteran and the troubled teenager. "Arthur, Logan has been helping elderly veterans for 6 weeks now. He's seen firsthand what service and sacrifice look like. Young man, your grandfather was right about veterans being special," Arthur said after a long pause. "But what makes us special isn't the uniforms we wore or the battles we fought. What makes us special is that we chose to serve something bigger than ourselves, even when it was dangerous or difficult." Logan listened intently as Arthur began sharing stories about his service in World War II, but more importantly, about the ordinary acts of courage and sacrifice that defined military life. These weren't tales of glory or heroism, but rather accounts of young people doing their duty despite fear, homesickness, and uncertainty about the future. As the afternoon progressed, Logan found himself helping Arthur organize his small kitchen, fix a loose cabinet door, and simply providing the kind of companionship that elderly people often lack. The work was humble and unglamorous, but it carried a significance that Logan was beginning to understand. The rehabilitation program was working, not because it punished the teenagers for their assault on Frederick Stevens, but because it connected them with people whose lives embodied the values they had rejected. Through daily contact with veterans who had sacrificed for others, the 4 young people were learning what genuine service looked like and discovering that respect must be earned through actions rather than demanded through aggression. 12 weeks after the assault at Veterans Memorial Park, Frederick Stevens stood at the podium in Springdale Community Center, his aluminum cane resting against the lectern as he addressed a crowd of over 200 community members gathered for the rehabilitation program's graduation ceremony. His injuries had healed well, though his left hip would never be quite the same, but the satisfaction in his eyes spoke to a different kind of healing. The restoration of 4 young lives and the strengthening of community bonds. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 months ago, 4 teenagers committed an act of violence that shocked our community, Frederick began, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout his military career. Today, those same 4 young people stand before you as examples of what's possible when we choose rehabilitation over retribution, understanding over anger. The teenagers sat in the front row, their transformation visible to everyone who had known them before the program began. Jaden Williams wore a pressed shirt and tie, his posture straight and his expression focused. Sophia Martinez sat beside her uncle Diego, who had taken leave from his Marine duties to attend the ceremony. Mason Carter held his parents' hands, the family tension that had characterized their relationship replaced by genuine communication and mutual support. Logan Brooks sat with Eleanor Davis, the elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to him during their months of working together. Judge Patricia Henderson stepped to the podium as Frederick took his seat among the honored guests. Her 23 years on the bench had shown her many attempts at juvenile rehabilitation, but few had demonstrated the comprehensive personal transformation she had witnessed in this case. Master Sergeant Stevens, Colonel Peterson, distinguished veterans and members of our community, Judge Henderson began. When I sentenced these 4 young people to community service, I had hopes for improvement, but no guarantees of genuine change. What I've witnessed over the past 12 weeks exceeds my most optimistic expectations. She consulted her notes, though the statistics were burned into her memory from months of monitoring the program's progress. Jaden Williams has completed 380 hours of community service, maintained perfect attendance at high school for the first time in 2 years, and has applied for admission to the Marine Corps Delayed Entry Program. Gasps of surprise and approval rippled through the audience as Kenneth Williams Sr. stood and applauded his son. The veteran father's eyes glistened with tears as he watched Jaden accept recognition for achievements that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Sofia Martinez has completed 375 hours of community service, raised her grade point average from 2.1 to 3.4, and has been accepted into the University of Arkansas nursing program with a scholarship sponsored by the local VFW post. Sergeant Major Diego Martinez stood and saluted his niece. The family rift that had divided them finally healed through shared commitment to service and honor. Isabella Martinez wept openly as she watched her daughter receive recognition for academic and personal achievements that vindicated years of struggle and sacrifice. Mason Carter has completed 370 hours of community service, earned certification as a nursing assistant, and has committed to 1 year of volunteer service at the VA Medical Center in Little Rock before beginning college. Robert and Linda Carter stood together, their marital problems set aside as they celebrated their son's transformation from angry teenager to dedicated young man committed to serving others. The family counseling they had undertaken as part of the program had taught them to communicate more effectively and support each other through difficult times. Logan Brooks has completed 365 hours of community service, maintained a 3.8 grade point average, and has been awarded a full academic scholarship to Arkansas State University, where he plans to study social work with a focus on veteran services. Richard and Sharon Brooks held each other tightly as they watched their youngest child receive recognition for academic excellence and community service. The financial pressures that had driven them to neglect Logan's emotional needs had been addressed through community support and better time management, allowing them to rebuild their relationship with their son. Frederick returned to the podium for the ceremony's culminating moment. These 4 young people have not only completed their court-ordered community service, they have become integral parts of our Veterans Support Network. More importantly, they have learned that respect is earned through service, not demanded through intimidation. Frank Sullivan maneuvered his wheelchair to the front of the room, his Korean War veteran cap precisely positioned and his bearing radiating the dignity that had impressed Jaden from their first meeting. Despite his 88 years and physical limitations, Frank's voice carried clearly throughout the community center. Jaden Williams started this program as an angry kid who had no respect for authority, Frank announced. He's ending it as a young man who understands that real strength comes from protecting others, not hurting them. I'm proud to call him my friend. The emotional weight of Frank's endorsement was not lost on anyone in the room. For 12 weeks, the Korean War veteran had challenged Jaden to confront his anger and channel it toward positive purposes. Their relationship had evolved from reluctant cooperation to genuine affection and mutual respect. Raymond Washington stepped forward next, his gentle demeanor reflecting the compassion that had made him an effective field medic in Vietnam. Sofia Martinez came to me carrying guilt that was eating her alive. She's learned that guilt can be a teacher rather than a destroyer, and she's committed herself to healing others as a way of honoring the healing she's received. The bond between Doc and Sofia had become particularly strong during their months of working together. Her natural empathy and intelligence had made her an excellent assistant in his volunteer medical work with veterans, while his wisdom and patience had helped her process the shame of her assault on Frederick. Harold Jenkins consulted his clipboard one final time before addressing the audience. Mason Carter taught me that young people still understand the value of hard work when they're given meaningful tasks. He's restored documents that preserve naval history for future generations, and more importantly, he's restored faith in his generation's potential. The Navy veteran's methodical approach to teaching had matched perfectly with Mason's need for structure and clear expectations. Their work together had given Mason confidence in his abilities, while teaching him that respect must be earned through consistent effort rather than demanded through aggression. Eleanor Davis struggled to stand with her walker, but her voice was strong as she spoke about Logan. "This young man has brought joy and purpose back into my life and the lives of dozens of elderly veterans who had been forgotten by their community. He's learned that the greatest honor comes from serving those who can never repay you." Logan's work with isolated elderly veterans had become legendary in Springdale's senior community. His genuine care and attention had alleviated loneliness for dozens of people while teaching him that meaningful relationships require investment of time and emotional energy. Colonel Peterson stood to deliver the ceremony's final military address. "Master Sergeant Stevens, these 4 young people have demonstrated the transformation that's possible when military values are taught with patience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to excellence. They honor the uniform and the sacrifices of all who have served." The Marine Reserve Battalion had monitored the program's progress throughout its 12-week duration, providing support and resources while allowing the civilian-veteran partnerships to develop naturally. Their involvement had ensured that the teenagers understood the broader military community's investment in their success. As the formal ceremony concluded, individual conversations began throughout the community center. Parents spoke with veterans about continuing support for their children's development, while teenagers made commitments to maintain their relationships with the elderly veterans who had become their mentors and friends. Jaden approached Frank, Sullivan's wheelchair, his expression serious and respectful. "Sergeant Sullivan, I want you to know that everything I learned from you will stay with me, whether I'm accepted into the Marines or not." "Williams, you've already shown me that honor isn't about the uniform you wear. It's about the choices you make when nobody's watching," Frank replied, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "You've got what it takes to be a good Marine, but more importantly, you've got what it takes to be a good man." Sophia hugged Doc Washington tightly, tears streaming down her face as she contemplated their future separation. "Doc, I'll never be able to thank you enough for showing me how to turn guilt into purpose." "Child, you don't owe me thanks," Doc replied softly. "You owe it to yourself to use what you've learned to help other people find their way back from mistakes. That's how healing spreads through communities." Mason shook hands formally with Harold Jenkins, his gesture reflecting the naval traditions he had learned during their months of working together. "Mr. Jenkins, I promise I'll keep preserving military history and sharing these stories with people my age. Carter, you've learned that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about people making choices that shape the future." Harold replied with satisfaction. "Keep teaching that lesson, and you'll honor everyone who served." Logan embraced Eleanor Davis gently, mindful of her frailty, but needing to express his gratitude for her guidance and patience. "Mrs. Davis, you saved my life by showing me how to care about other people." "Logan, you saved my life by giving me purpose again," Eleanor replied, patting his cheek with grandmotherly affection. "Promise me you'll keep visiting Arthur and the others even when you're away at college." Frederick Stevens watched these interactions with the satisfaction of a teacher whose students had exceeded all expectations. The rehabilitation program had succeeded beyond his hopes, transforming not just 4 troubled teenagers, but strengthening the entire community's commitment to supporting veterans and teaching young people about service and sacrifice. As the crowd began to disperse, Frederick remained at the podium, reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 3 months earlier, he had been assaulted and humiliated by 4 angry teenagers who saw him only as a symbol of the authority they resented. Tonight, Those same 4 young people had demonstrated genuine transformation and committed themselves to serving others with the same dedication he had brought to his military career. The assault in Veterans Memorial Park had been a moment of cruelty that shocked the community, but it had also created an opportunity for healing that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Frederick's choice to seek rehabilitation rather than revenge had demonstrated the power of military values when applied to civilian challenges, while the teenager's commitment to change had proven that redemption is possible when people are willing to do the hard work of personal transformation. 6 months later, Springdale, Arkansas had become a model community for veteran youth partnerships, with similar programs being implemented in towns across the state. The 4 teenagers who had once assaulted a 93-year-old veteran had become ambassadors for the power of second chances and the importance of honoring those who served. Most importantly, Frederick Stevens had reclaimed his daily walks through Veterans Memorial Park, but now he was often accompanied by young people who understood that respect for veterans isn't just about saying thank you for your service. It's about living lives worthy of the sacrifices that made their freedom possible. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.